Our time has come. We stand united against the darkness. Together, we will forge a new future.
Power is a substance. It can be held, wielded, and measured. It is measured in divisions, in tons of steel, in speeches that move millions. But power also has a shadow. It is a shadow of privilege, of wealth, of access. It is a world of gilded, luxurious lives, lived just adjacent to the mechanisms of absolute terror. In Nazi Germany, this shadow world was populated by the wives and mistresses of the state's leaders. They were, for a time, the queens of Europe. They were held up as symbols of perfect German womanhood, while living lives of opulent decadence at the expense of a plundered continent. They often wielded considerable, subtle influence. They were the gatekeepers, the confidantes, the first ladies of a regime built on murder. Then, in May 1945, the light source was extinguished. The power vanished. The men who wielded it were dead, captured, or running. Their world did not just end, it evaporated. And the women, who had had it all, were left with nothing but a name. What happened to them? What happened to their children, the princelings of the Reich? When their husbands and lovers fell so dramatically from power, how did the Allies treat the spouses of the men who had set the world on fire? This is a story that does not end in the Berlin bunker. It is a story of survival, denial, hypocrisy, and complicity. It is a story that spans more than 75 years, from the times Götterdämmerung times of 1945 to the present day. Many of the children of Hitler's inner circle are alive today. The story begins, as so many do, in the strange, rarefied atmosphere of the inner circle. It begins with a wedding, and with Adolf Hitler's sister-in-law. The title was, of course, unofficial. Hitler had no sister-in-law until the very last day of his life, but the woman who would hold that title was Gretel Braun, the younger sister of Eva Braun. Gretel was a fixture of the court around Hitler, the small, insulated group of adjutants, secretaries, and friends who lived in the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat on the Obersalzberg. She was part of the scenery, a companion for her sister. In 1944, as the Reich was beginning to crumble on every front, Gretel's life was ascending. She had married SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein. Fegelein was a creature of the system. A dashing, opportunistic cavalryman, he was Heinrich Himmler's personal liaison officer to Hitler's headquarters. He was an insider. Their marriage, in June 1944, was a major social event for the Nazi elite. The ceremony was held at Berchtesgaden. The witnesses were two of the most powerful and most feared men in the Reich, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, and Martin Bormann, the Brown Eminence, Hitler's personal secretary, and the invisible hand controlling all access to the Times Führer asterisk. This was a union blessed by the high priests of the regime. After the ceremony, the happy couple visited Hitler at the Berghof, his private house. Then, a wedding breakfast was hosted at the Times Kelstein House asterisk, the Eagle's Nest, that famous, almost mythical reception house, perched atop the Kelstein Mountain, a gift from the Nazi Party for Hitler's 50th birthday. A brass elevator, drilled through solid rock, carried the guests up to a panoramic view of the Alps. There they were, clinking champagne glasses, celebrating a marriage, floating above a continent in flames. This wedding took place just 3 days before the D-Day landings in Normandy. The disconnect between the lives of the elite and the reality of the war was absolute. Gretel remained in this bubble. She had accompanied her sister Eva to the Reich Chancellery in bomb-battered Berlin on the 19th of January, 1945. She went to see her husband, Fegelein, who was stationed with Hitler, but she returned to the Obersalzberg on the 9th of February. Eva went back alone to Berlin to join Hitler in the Times Führerbunker asterisk, a place she would never leave alive. Gretel stayed on the mountain. She was pregnant. In the final, apocalyptic days of the Battle of Berlin, the world unravelled for Gretel and Hermann. Her husband, Fegelein, sensing the end, deserted the bunker. He was apprehended by Hitler's bodyguards. This came on the back of the ultimate betrayal. Heinrich Himmler, Fegelein's boss and wedding witness, had been secretly negotiating a surrender with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. Hitler, in a paroxysm of rage, fueled by the paranoia of Martin Bormann, needed a scapegoat. Fegelein was the perfect target. He was condemned to death for desertion. Despite Eva Braun's pleas for her sister's husband, Fegelein was shot in the Reich Chancellery Garden, a grim execution in the twilight of the gods. This was early on the 29th of April, 1945. Hours later, in the bunker, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. It was his reward for her many years of loyalty. And in that moment, with that bizarre subterranean ceremony, the widowed Gretel Fegelein officially became Adolf Hitler's sister-in-law. The next day, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. A week later, on the 5th of May, 1945, the war in Europe effectively over, Gretel gave birth to a girl at the resort town of Zell am See. She named the baby Eva, after the sister she would never see again. Gretel was now a widow, a new mother, and the sister-in-law of the most hated man in history. She was also the keeper of a valuable trove of historical material. Her husband, Hermann Fegelein, had been part of the 8th SS Cavalry Division Florian Geyer. His brother was chief of staff there. They had hidden all of Gretel's personal effects at Fishhorn Castle, the division's headquarters. It was a treasure chest of the inner circle, photo albums, jewelry, amateur film footage, and letters. Many letters written between Hitler and Eva Braun. This was the private, unguarded history of the Berghof. Shortly after the war, Gretel was befriended by a German refugee. He was sympathetic, kind. He persuaded her to show him the hiding place of this valuable, significant material. Gretel, trusting, agreed. The refugee was, in reality, an agent for the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC. All the material was seized. It was sent to Washington, D.C., a priceless historical record, though some of it has since disappeared, and some of it has never been shown to the public. Gretel Fegelein rebuilt her life. In 1954, she married Kurt Berlinghoff, a businessman in Munich. The marriage produced no children, but the story of her daughter, the child named for Eva Braun, ends in tragedy. Eva Fegelein committed suicide in June 1971. She was 26 years old. She had killed herself following the death of her fiancé in a car crash. Gretel, in her later life, suffered from Alzheimer's disease. She died in October 1987 in the town of Steingarten, Bavaria. She was 72, the last quiet ember of the Berghof court. The two witnesses at Gretel's wedding, Himmler and Bormann, had far more complex and far more hypocritical family arrangements. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, the man whose name is synonymous with industrial murder, was a shy, fastidious, almost prudish man. He was a late bloomer. He met his future wife, Margrethe, in 1927. She was a nurse. They shared an interest in homeopathy and herbal medicine. They were married in July 1928. Margrethe was 7 years older than Himmler. The marriage produced only one child, a daughter named Gudrun, born in 1929. Later, the Himmlers adopted a boy, Gerhard von der Ahe, the son of an SS officer who had died before the war. Himmler was, by the 1932nd, one of the busiest men in the Reich. He was building his SS empire. He saw little of his wife. The couple maintained two residences, a large villa in Berlin's Dahlem district, a wealthy suburb, and a house at Gmund on the Tegernsee, a beautiful lake in Bavaria. The marriage grew cold, but Himmler doted on his daughter, Gudrun. She was his puppy, his little doll. He spent as much time with her as he could. She accompanied her father on many state occasions and official visits, including, as photographs infamously prove, at least one visit to the Dachau concentration camp. She is seen, a smiling, blonde-haired girl, walking with her father, the Times Reichsführer SS*. Himmler, the man who demanded ironclad moral standards from his SS subordinates, was about to find love with a younger woman. In 1938, he took a fancy to one of his secretaries, a woman named Hedwig Potthast, 12 years his junior. She was his opposite, lively, cheerful, and direct. They became romantically involved in 1939 after Himmler declared his love for her. He wanted to divorce Margrethe and marry Hedwig. But such a move was politically impossible. It would have been hypocritical. The Reichsführer SS, who officially frowned upon and punished adultery and divorce within his SS corps, could not be seen to be doing the very thing he forbade. So, Hedwig Potthast became Himmler's long-term mistress. A second, secret family. They lived together off and on in Mecklenburg. Hedwig bore him 2 children, a son, Helga, born in 1942, and a daughter, Nanette Dorothea, born on the 20th of July, 1944, a date seared into history. Himmler's second daughter was born the very same day that a conspiracy of army officers led by Claus von Stauffenberg blew up Hitler with a bomb at the Wolf's Lair. At the end of the war, as Himmler was attempting to negotiate his own survival and was ultimately captured by the British, his 2 families scattered. His mistress, Hedwig, was living in Rosenheim with her 2 small children. She was staying with the wife of SS Obergruppenführer Oswald Pohl, one of Himmler's top commanders, the man who ran the entire economic administration of the concentration camp system, a major war criminal. Himmler's wife, Margrethe, had been working as a wartime nurse for the German Red Cross in a very senior position. His adopted son, Gerhard, saw combat against the Soviets as part of a Hitler Youth unit. He was captured, but later released. He survived the war. Both Himmler's wife and his mistress remained loyal to him right up to the end. On the 23rd of May 1945, in British custody, Heinrich Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his tooth. He was dead, but the consequences for his families were just beginning. Margrethe and her daughter, Gudrun, had fled their home at Gmund just ahead of advancing US troops. They made it to Bolzano in Italy, where they were arrested. The Americans held them in a series of internment camps in Italy, in France, in Germany. Finally, they were taken to Nuremberg to testify at the famous trials. This experience, the arrest, the internment, the humiliation, and the rabid anti-Nazi sentiment, had a profound, formative effect on Gudrun. It did not break her. It hardened her. It turned her into a devout, unshakable defender of her father for the rest of her life. Margrethe and Gudrun were released in November 1946. Margrethe, too, was bitter. She was put through the denazification process. She legally challenged her classification, which was based largely on her high rank in the German Red Cross. In 1951, her category was changed to the lowest, Category V, meaning she was not held responsible for her husband's crimes. But in 1953 she was reclassified again, this time as Category 2, a beneficiary of the Nazi regime. She received 30 days of punitive work, lost her pension rights, and lost the right to vote. She lived with her sister and her adopted son in a small apartment in Hiepen. Her last years were spent with her daughter, Gudrun, in Munich. Margrethe Himmler died in 1967 at the age of 73. Her daughter, Gudrun, however, became a public figure. She became the Nazi princess, a vocal, visible, and highly respected supporter in West Germany's neo-Nazi community. She married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, an author and journalist who was heavily involved with Germany's far-right wing party, the NPD. They had 2 children. Gudrun became deeply involved with Time's Stille Hilfe Asterisk, or Silent Help. It was an organization that provided aid, comfort, and legal support to former Nazi and SS officers who were in prison or on the run. She was, in effect, a fairy godmother to war criminals. She helped men like Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, and Martin Sommer, the hangman of Buchenwald. Because she was Times Himmler's daughter Asterisk, she was held in very high regard. She was royalty to the unrepentant. Gudrun Berwitz died in May 2018 at her home in Munich. She was 88 years old. She had never, for a single day, stopped believing in her father. And what of the secret family? Himmler's mistress, Hedwig Potthast, was arrested by the US Army in July 1945. She was interrogated, but was seen as less of a figure than the official wife. She later settled in Teisendorf. She remained in contact with the family of Himmler's older brother, Gebhard, and with Karl Wolff, the former chief of Himmler's personal staff. The old SS network endured. Hedwig Potast later married and changed her surname. Her son, Helge, struggled all his life with poor health and lived with his mother. Her daughter, Nanette Dorothea, the child born on the day of the July 20th plot, became a medical doctor. She is believed to be alive today, living in northern Germany. Hedwig Potast, the woman who had been Himmler's true love, died in Baden-Baden in September 1994. She was 82. Himmler's great rival, the witness at Gretel Braun's wedding, was Martin Bormann. And Bormann, like Himmler, was a profound hypocrite concerning the family values his regime officially espoused. In 1929, Bormann had married Gerda Buck. She was 19 years old. Gerda was Nazi royalty herself. Her father was Walter Buck, a senior Nazi figure, the supreme judge of the party court. She knew Hitler well. Hitler and Rudolf Hess were the witnesses at their wedding. The Nazi state officially encouraged and even subsidized big families. The Bormann family was the ultimate example. It was huge. Gerda bore 10 children between 1,930 and 1,943. One child died as a baby. This large brood was a constant presence on the Obersalzberg. The Bormann villa was located right next door to Hitler's house, the Berghof. The children were often filmed with Uncle Adolf. They were, in a sense, the model family of the Reich. Many of the children were named for their godparents, the Nazi elite. The eldest, born in 1930, was Martin Adolf Bormann, named for his godfather, Adolf Hitler. Another son was named Rudolf for Rudolf Hess, though his name was later, politically, changed to Helmut after Hess's flight to Scotland in 1941. Another son, Heinrich, was named for Heinrich Himmler, and a daughter, Eva, was named for Hitler's girlfriend, Eva Braun. Gerda Bormann was a true believer, a fanatical anti-Semite. But her marriage to Bormann was not easy. Martin Bormann, the Brown Eminence, was a coarse, brutal, and constantly unfaithful man. Gerda was a tall woman who towered over her short, stocky husband. He often humiliated her in front of guests. Yet, in private letters, he behaved in a loving and sentimental manner. Gerda, in her fanaticism, supported the idea of parallel marriages, an idea popular in some SS circles, that a valuable man should be able to have multiple wives to produce more racially pure offspring for the Times Führer asterisk. She tolerated his affairs accordingly. One of Bormann's mistresses was the film star Manja Behrens. They had no children together. At the war's end, Martin Bormann, unlike Himmler, stayed in the Berlin bunker with Hitler to the bitter end. He disappeared in the early, chaotic hours of May 2nd, 1945, during a breakout attempt by the surviving bunker personnel. His fate remained a mystery for decades. Gerda and her 9 children had sought refuge in Wolkenstein, a mountain village near Bolzano in Italy, the same area where Himmler's family had been. She was arrested and interrogated by US forces. She was moved to a hospital in Merano. It was discovered that she had uterine cancer. Gerda Bormann died in that hospital in April 1946. She was 37 years old. Her children were now orphans. They were adopted by a Catholic priest. The fate of the Bormann children is one of the strangest legacies of the Reich. The elder son, Martin Adolf Bormann, Hitler's godson, later became a Roman Catholic priest himself. It was a profound rejection of his father's ideology. He later left the priesthood, married a former nun, and had children. He died in 2013. 6 of Martin Bormann's children are still alive today, living quiet lives, carrying a name synonymous with the dark, bureaucratic heart of the Nazi regime. Not all of the Nazi leaders remained in favor until the end. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was a man who had fallen from grace long before 1945. He had been a highly influential figure in the 1930 seconds as Hitler used diplomacy and threats to expand his influence. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement, the Anti-Comintern Pact, the Pact of Steel, and his masterpiece, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But, with the coming of war, diplomacy fell by the wayside, and with it, Ribbentrop's position. He was a man of staggering arrogance and limited intellect. The other leaders, Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, despised him. He contented himself by continuing to play a limited role at Hitler's court and in enriching himself. At the war's end, he made himself scarce. He abandoned his family and sought refuge in Hamburg. He was eventually tracked down on the 14th of June, 1945, by a Belgian section of the British SAS. They found him in a squalid flat in the company of a young woman. The vain, ambitious diplomat, who had dreamed of being a greater Bismarck, was arrested in disgrace. He was subsequently tried at Nuremberg, convicted, and was the first of the Nazi leaders to be hanged. In 1920, Ribbentrop, then a dashing cavalry officer, had married Anna Henkel. Anneliese, as she was known, was the daughter of Otto Henkel, a wealthy wine producer from Wiesbaden. It was a marriage that brought Ribbentrop wealth and social standing. Anneliese, according to her mother, had married beneath her aristocratic social status. Her mother hated Ribbentrop. Together, they would have 5 children. Anneliese was noted by contemporaries as a stubborn, headstrong woman who completely controlled her husband. It was she who pushed him into joining the Nazi Party, seeing it as a vehicle for his and her ambition. Even Hitler noted that Anneliese appeared to wear the trousers in their marriage. At the war's end, Anneliese was arrested. She was held at the Dachau internment camp, in the same complex where the infamous concentration camp had been. She and her husband had grown fabulously wealthy. The Allies tried to strip her of that wealth, but she fought back vigorously through the courts. She argued, successfully, that much of her fortune was not Nazi plunder, but had derived from inheritances from her father's wine business. She wrote several books defending her husband's actions. She died in 1973, fairly unrepentant, at the age of 77. Their children, however, had interesting fates. The eldest son, Rudolf von Ribbentrop, had been a highly decorated Waffen-SS captain during the war. He had been educated at Westminster School in London when his father was the German ambassador. He fought on the Eastern Front, earning the Knight's Cross for gallantry in combat. He was wounded 5 times in action. After the war, he became a businessman in the wine industry. He died in 2019, at the age of 98. Longevity seems to be a von Ribbentrop trait. As of today, 3 of von Ribbentrop's children are still alive. His son, Adolf von Ribbentrop, named after you-know-who, is 85. His daughter Ursula is currently 88, and his daughter Bettina is 98. But perhaps the most important, most visible, and most powerful of all the Nazi wives was not Himmler's, Bormann's, or even, until the last day, Hitler's. It was Emmy Göring, the second wife of the Reichsmarshal, Hermann Göring. Born in 1893, Emmy Sonnemann was an established actress in Weimar, Germany. She had been married once before to a fellow actor, but they divorced on amicable terms in 1926. She met Hermann Göring in the early 1932. Hermann's first wife, Karin, who was Swedish, had been the love of his life. She had died in October 1931 of heart failure. Göring was devastated by her death. He would perpetuate her name forever in his grand country estate outside Berlin, which he named times Karinhall ***. He even had her body moved there, to a special crypt on the site. When Göring blew up Karinhall in April 1945 as the Red Army approached, her remains were left in the ruins. They were discovered in 1991 and subsequently reburied in Sweden. Göring married Emmy in 1935. It was a lavish state wedding in Berlin, a pageant of Nazi power. In 1938, a daughter was born. She was named Edda after Mussolini's daughter, Countess Edda Ciano. Emmy and the Countess were good friends. Emmy was soon described as the First Lady of the Reich. She was an elegant hostess. She enjoyed to the absolute full her husband's decadent and lavish lifestyle. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, the plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, was the great plunderer of the Reich. He owned countless houses, castles, and hunting lodges. All were decorated with the finest things, including art looted from Jewish collectors and museums across Europe. Emmy lived at the center of this world of fantasy. Interestingly, Emmy had no time for Hitler's girlfriend, Eva Braun. She treated Eva in a patronizing and contemptuous way. Emmy saw herself as the true First Lady. Eva was just the mistress. The friction between them became so bad that Hitler himself had to intervene and order Göring to have his wife treat Eva with respect. Later, apparently, Emmy was even banned from Hitler's house, the Berghof. This, despite the fact that the Görings maintained a lavish house on the Obersalzberg, just behind Bormann's property. Göring's daughter, Edda, was treated like a princess. She was spoiled with clothes, toys, and lavish playhouses. This included a 50-meter-long replica of Frederick the Great's palace of Sanssouci, a gift paid for by the Luftwaffe. Edda was Göring's only child, and he doted on her. Unlike the other Nazi leaders, Göring did not take mistresses. He remained completely faithful to his wife. In the latter part of the war, Göring's star gradually fell. His air force, the Luftwaffe, had failed. It failed to defeat Britain. It failed at Stalingrad. And now it was failing to stop the Allied air raids that were destroying city after city in Germany. A few days before Hitler died, Göring, who was in the south of Germany, made a disastrous miscalculation. Believing that Hitler was trapped in his bunker and no longer able to exercise control, Göring sent a telegram, unwisely attempting to succeed him as leader. Martin Bormann, in the bunker, seized the telegram. He convinced Hitler that Göring was committing high treason. Hitler, in a final fit of rage, ordered Göring arrested. Göring was held under house arrest with his family, with Emmy and Edda, at his home on the Obersalzberg. They survived the heavy RAF bombing raid that destroyed or damaged most of the Nazi buildings on the mountain. The SS then evacuated them to Göring's castle at Mortendorf. Freed on the 5th of May, as the war was almost over, Göring attempted to reach U.S. lines. He was delusional. He believed he could negotiate the German surrender personally with General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He, his family, and his staff were apprehended by a special U.S. intelligence mission. They were taken to Fishhorn Castle, the same place where Gretel Fegelein's treasures were hidden, on the 7th of May, 1945. From there, Göring was taken to U.S. headquarters and formally arrested as a war crime suspect. Emmy and Edda remained at Fishhorn Castle for a time. They were then interned at Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, the code name for a holding facility for the most high-value Nazi captives. Released, they moved into one of their many castles, Burg Weldenstein, near Nuremberg. Hermann Göring was the star defendant at the Nuremberg trials. Emmy and Edda were allowed to visit him in the court prison. On the 15th of October, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution by hanging, Göring committed suicide with a concealed cyanide capsule. He had amassed a truly staggering amount of wealth. Sorting out what was Göring's personal property, what was state property, what was plunder, and what belonged to his wife and daughter was a legal nightmare for the Allies. Emmy Göring was punished as part of the denazification process. She was convicted of being a Nazi and sentenced to 1 year in prison. She also suffered the confiscation of 30% of her remaining property. She and her daughter Edda lived in several places after the war, while Edda completed her schooling. Emmy eventually purchased a small flat in a modern block in Munich. She published her autobiography in 1967, and Der Zeit meines Mannes, At My Husband's Side. She died in 1973. Her daughter Edda grew into an attractive young woman. She studied law at the University of Munich. She worked as a law clerk and in a hospital laboratory. She never married. She cared for her mother, Emmy, until her death. Edda became romantically involved with a German journalist named Gerd Heidemann. Heidemann was the man who, in the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds, discovered the infamous and utterly fake Hitler diaries. Heidemann, funded by the magazine that bought the diaries, purchased Hermann Göring's old yacht, the Times Karin II*, and refurbished it. Edda was his girlfriend for 5 years. She introduced him to her circle of Nazi friends, including former SS generals Karl Wolff and Wilhelm Mohnke, the officer responsible for defending the Reich Chancellery and the Times Führerbunker *. The network of the Old Guard and their children remained. Edda petitioned the Bavarian government for compensation concerning the expropriation of her father's huge estate. Her petition was rejected. Edda Göring, like Gudrun Himmler, remained an unrepentant defender of her father's memory. She died by a strange coincidence the same year as Himmler's daughter. She passed away in 2018 and is buried in Munich. She was 80 years old. The wives and mistresses of the Third Reich, the women who lived in the shadow of absolute power, met different fates. Some, like Gerda Bormann, died in the immediate aftermath. Some, like Emmy Göring, faced legal and financial ruin, but rebuilt quiet lives. Some, like Gretel Braun, faded back into obscurity. But the legacy they passed to their children was a heavy, dark, and complex one. A choice. To reject the past, like Martin Bormann Jr., who found solace in the priesthood, or to embrace it, like Gudrun Himmler, who became a princess for the unrepentant, or, like Edda Göring, to live a life in defense of a memory, forever tied to the name of a father who was both a doting parent and a monster of history. The wives are gone, the children are old, but the shadow of the power they all once knew remains.